Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. This is another great opportunity. We're really excited to be here talking to everybody through the Craft Beer Professionals organization about a hopefully very exciting topic today. My name is Alex Koral. I'm Regulatory General Counsel for Sovos ShipCompliant, and I'm joined by Candace Moon from Craft Beer Attorney.
Hello.
And we are here to talk to you all about going beyond beer, sort of the laws, regulations, sort of some of the background of what to do when you want to start expanding your production and getting into the other exciting areas of the beverage alcohol industry that are out there. You know, this is a time when I think a lot of producers out there are looking for the next thing, trying to keep up with consumers, especially with these new developing products. But there are a lot of rules and considerations that go into when you are expanding. And that's what we want to kind of talk about. A little bit about what you can do currently, and then make sure that you're set up to go into those new exciting horizons as best you can. As I said, you know, we are both attorneys on this, so I should put up a little bit of a warning there that what we say is purely advice. You know, if you are going to go on and actually do things, apply for new licenses, expand your business, do consult with your attorney. Everybody is different. Everybody has unique considerations. And so while the information we're providing, I think, should elicit conversations and questions for you going forward, again, don't say, well, Alex and Candace said this, and therefore I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. So always check up on that. It's a little bit of our caveat there. I think we should have time for questions too at the end, or even along if you are watching this live and want to clarify something. Please let us know in that comments box. Otherwise, I think we'll get into this. So quick, again, just to set things, who we are, what we're doing here. As I said, I'm from Sovos ShipCompliant. Sovos ShipCompliant is a software service. We are the leading provider of software service for supporting interstate distribution and shipping of beverage alcohol. We've been active for now over 20 years, providing these full suite of services and products for breweries, wineries, distilleries, cideries, all manner of producers and other participants in the beverage alcohol industry. Again, as you are managing their interstate shipping, interstate distribution, all those, some TTB federal compliance as well, all those little minute details that get in the way, we can help you handle and automate that, which is a little bit different than the craft beer attorney. Candace, you want to talk about what craft beer attorney is?
Sure. Craft beer attorney was started in 2009 by myself to basically be a one-stop legal shop for craft beer, craft breweries specifically. And over the years, we have taken on some other alcohol clients as well. We've definitely expanded our base, but we basically are alcohol specific only, and mostly on the manufacturer or brand owner side. So we don't represent any distributors. We actually do a lot of reviewing of distribution contracts, a lot of trademarks, a lot of state and federal licensing. And we also have taken on compliance for some of our clients who don't have the time or maybe the inclination to do it themselves.
Yeah, it can be a hefty burden, and we well understand the you know, you're all out there. You want to do the fun stuff of actually making the beer, making it good, and so yeah, we'll be here to help with the boring stuff. And Candace especially, you know, one of those attorneys we talk to that you want to make sure are standing behind you and are ensuring that you are dotting your T's and crossing your T's and dotting your I's and all of that going forward.
Don't dot your T's.
Yeah, they're just very tall I's then. So for our conversation today, what we're talking about is, again, sort of the what happens when you want to move beyond just beer. You know, there's all this interest in wine products, spirits products, mixture products, RTDs, all these different things up there. And so what are the different products out there? We'll talk a little bit first about what you can do currently with your beer production licenses and a little bit of those nuances that are there. And then we'll talk, you know, brief about more of the breaking it down to the federal versus the state rules for those non-beer products, the wines and spirits that are out there. It is kind of the convenient thing about this industry is how everything more or less falls into one of three categories, all alcohol divided into three parts, either beer, wine, or spirits. It's just a matter of figuring out what actually your products are, and then all those little details on the rules for those products. And that's kind of what we're going to be trying to get into and trying to elucidate today. So first off, what can you do with your brewer's notice? You are a beer manufacturer, you are producing, you're selling. You want to look into something else. What is immediately available? So the first thing that always needs to happen with these products is figuring out the definition. This is sort of the not necessarily dirty secret of law, but it always comes down to the definitions. That's whenever I'm looking up a law, that's the first place I start is the definitions list, because that will tell you everything about what's going forward. You may think you know what beer is. The government has a different definition of that. So you don't want to just say, apply your standard definitions for any of these. So when we're talking about beer, we're really talking about what are the products that are available under your brewer's notice. What are the things that the federal government allows you to do with your brewer's notice? Because they say you can make beer and malt beverages. But again, what does that mean? We have to look to these two founding statutes out there in the federal government. So you have the Internal Revenue Code and the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. They each have separate definitions for beer and malt with different categories. So the IRC, that's a very expansive definition. Essentially, this is any fermented beverage using malt and malt substitutes. And then there are a lot of various malt substitutes out there, from rice, sugar, bran, molasses, all those sort of things. If you are taking those products, fermenting it, you're making an IRC beer, as it's called. On the other hand, the Federal Alcohol Administration Act has some more qualifications for beer, or for malt beverages, as they call them. These are, again, a fermented beverage using malted barley or substitutes. The critical thing is that to be an FAA malt beverage, it has to also include hops. If you are not using hops in your production, then it is not a malt beverage under the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, and in fact, then would not be subject to a lot of the Federal Alcohol Administration provisions, which we will talk about going forward. So again, this is all just a matter of understanding what are the different definitions, what are you making, and then how does it qualify? Because, and we'll talk similarly about what it means to be a spirit, cider, wine, all these different products, because if you do not fit the specific definition of these products, then you're not subject to the regulations that apply to those products. And you may be subject to other regulations that you want to know about. So again, when we're talking about beer, what are the kind of regulations? And maybe, Candace, do you want to talk a little bit about, hopefully this is more a review for everybody, but what are sort of the very basic federal rules around beer?
Okay, so on a very superficial level, so when you have your brewer's notice, generally you're going to be dealing with formulas, theoretically, labeling, reporting, and taxes. So formulas are required if you're using any ingredients other than malt, hops, yeast, and water, and what seems to be a random list of ingredients on the TTB accepted list, which I believe is from 2013 and never been updated officially. For example, I believe lemons are okay, but limes require formulas. It's that kind of
nuance.
I was going to say nuance, and then illogical also came to mind. But just make sure, and that is regardless of whether you are crossing state lines or not. So TTB, since you have a brewer's notice, is kind of the one making sure that what you're putting into our food and beverage system is safe for consumers. So labeling, which if you are crossing state lines, you hopefully know that you have to have a certificate of label approval, known as a COLA, in order to send those across state lines. And the states you're sending to will most likely require copies of those as well. If you're purely interstate, you don't need a COLA, but you do actually still have to be following the requirements of the COLA. So you still need brand name, content statements, the government health warning, exactly the way you have to do it if you're getting a COLA. You just don't have the feds looking at approving it and giving you the piece of paper that says you can do it. and then I'm sure all your states have their own various different labeling rules, which I think Alex will discuss a little bit later on. Reporting, you have quarterly Brewers Report of Operations, BROP reports, and excise tax returns. You need to file those even if you haven't produced anything. So for those of you who may have either be new or have a second location and you've gotten your TTB license, but you haven't started producing, you still need to be filing 0 reports quarterly and 0 excise tax returns. So as depending on the size of your brewery, basically depending on how much tax you owe, you may have to file more often. Basically, the more money you owe, the sooner the government wants it from you. And then tax rates, we were at $3.50 for the first 60,000 barrels. If once you pass that mark, it's $16 a barrel. But however, for any brewer that produces more than 2 million barrels a calendar year, so the big guys, they all pay $16 a barrel.
Yeah, presumably not many people on this call, but one day we can dream. But again, it's very important then to recognize you have those reduced tax rates, so make sure you're paying that proper rate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just one quick thing with the labeling as well, that the COLA is also, why you have to follow the rules for labeling on all products is because the rules around brand name, government warning are found in both the IRC and the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. However, that COLA approval process is only required by the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. So this is, again, where if your product does not have hops, then not only do you not need a COLA, you are not able to get a COLA at all. The TTB will just say no. And so there other rules may apply, but again, that's just one more step to watch out for. And again, why this comes down to those specific rules and understanding what actually you are making. And this is, again, as we're talking about these different products, here we're moving on to the first more specific one that I think has been really pretty popular in the recent zeitgeist is kombucha. This is a natural product that has existed in a lot of formats over the years, but has become under scrutiny as it's become much more popular out there. And that is because this is a product that does ferment. It does get over 0.5% ABV. And when you're hitting that 0.5% ABV, that's very much a magic threshold. That means a lot of these rules suddenly apply. So if you are going to make kombucha, if you want to get into this, again, I think this is a great product. It's often very low ABV. So when you are looking at those low ABV products for people who don't really want to drink, this could be a great option. But then recognize that the rules do apply. So kombucha, generally, it's this, again, a fermented beverage product. It's made from a combination of steeped tea and sugar. There's often a lot of combination of different yeast strains, bacterias. I think mushrooms and other fungi can often be included. And it will ferment. And when it does, that, again, makes it subject to both federal and state rules for alcohol production, distribution, and sale. And importantly, you have to be aware that this includes post-bottling fermentation. So even if you put it in the bottle and you know that it's 0.0% ABV, if it's sitting on the shelf and will get over 0.5, then it becomes subject to these rules. So you either want to kill fermentation entirely or recognize that this may happen. And I think, anecdotally, you've heard of kombucha being pulled off of like Whole Food shelves because it turned out that it's, fermented while it's sitting there. And now at 2%, lots of kids are buying it. And so, again, you want to be aware of that. So, again, if you're making this product, recognize what it is. And then, again, I don't know, Candace, you want to talk a little bit about, are these rules different from making any other beer?
Yes. Unless you're putting malts in your kombucha, not malt, sorry. If you're putting hops in your kombucha, which I'm not sure I've seen that, but
could be good flavor.
Again, you're licensed in your brewer's notice. You can totally make licenses you have. Basically, all kombucha is going to need formula approval, generally because there are other additives and things getting put in that are definitely not on that accepted list. So I haven't seen one that hasn't needed formula approval. Again, if there are no hops, then you're not going to need the COLA, and you're going to fall under the IRC requirements for labeling, as well as FDA labeling guidelines, which means nutrition labeling. So definitely make sure you keep that in mind for kombucha. which also means that you're probably going to have it lab tested to get the numbers for the nutrition labeling to have that as within the required accuracy for your labels. You report it just like beer. It's taxed just like beer. So that part is pretty seamless.
Yeah, like pretty handy when it has that, you're getting your alcohol content from this sugar. Sugar is a malt substitute. Therefore, yeah, that's why these all apply. And quick there, we're going to talk, at least we're going to bring up FDA labeling a lot today. This will apply, again, whenever colas are not required or not eligible, FDA labeling will come there. And this is, I don't know how you're feeling about the Candace, but this is an area where you really want to talk to an FDA labeling expert. There are a lot of very persnickety special rules around it, and what you have to identify and how you can recognize the variances in different nutritional contents. So I've seen a couple webinars on FDA labeling, and again, all I can say is get help with that, because there's a lot to it. But we'll try to point out when this will be important to look into.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that, and I am not an FDA labeling expert. I mean, I will say there's some things that are fairly, and I think this does going to fall in the realm of kombucha, which is health statements and fun things like that people like to make. You've got to be very, very, very careful, and not just because of the federal guidelines, but potential consumer complaints and lawsuits. So, if you're calling it healthy and it might be healthier. I always find that funny. I'm like, well, I don't know if it's healthy, but it is healthier.
Yeah, it's a good call out there. So moving on, the other product we've seen a lot of interest in recently is the hard seltzers. Again, these are seltzers that have alcohol content in them, become very popular the last so many years. Notably, there is no actual definition of hard seltzers. This does not exist in statutes or regulations. This is much more of a general industry term. And from the industry term, we can kind of recognize these as, under the various names, they have a certain amount of criteria for them. So they are carbonated water, like a seltzer without alcohol, you would just get anywhere. However, these products then they might have fermented sugars or other additives in them, and then that will bring them up to a generally low alcohol content. These are also generally low in calories. So again, I think this is why these are fairly popular among consumers: low alcohol, low calories, good for whenever. But this does make it a little bit complicated because, as we're talking about these definitions of beer and the products, you have to recognize where you are getting your alcohol content, because that will indicate what rules will apply. So a seltzer can at any given time be a beer, wine, or spirits, depending on where it's coming from. I actually went out there and found a few years ago 3 different margaritas in a can. Each of them, one of them was a beer, one of them was a wine, one of them was a spirits, just because how they're getting that alcoholic content. And because of that, they had very different rules on how they could be produced and sold. So if you are making hard seltzers and you are making them from either malted products, malted barley, other malted grains, or a malt substitute, then it is considered a beer or malt beverage under at least the IRC. And again, a lot of these rules then we'll talk about. If you're including hops in your hard seltzer, again, maybe not the most common thing, but not impossible, that would then qualify it as a Federal Alcohol Administration malt beverage, with all those colas and other requirements there. So again, the key thing here is just recognizing how are you producing this, how are you getting the alcohol, because that will then say all the rules that apply. And again, speaking of which, if you are making a malt-based hard seltzer, it's again, these are I think hopefully common by now. I don't know if there's anything you want to call out on this page, Candace, that are unique for hard seltzers.
No, it's actually very similar to the kombucha in the sense that almost all of them are going to need formula approval. Again, if you have hops, you need a cola, but most of them do not. So you're looking at FDA labeling guidelines and IRC requirements. So nutrition information, reporting, again, exactly the same as the other two. And on the very high side, the taxes are the same as beer. So I don't know that we're going to talk about hard seltzer as a distilled spirit in depth, but I will point out that I did have a client years ago who was planning to do a vodka-based hard seltzer, and then looked at the taxes for distilled spirits versus beer, and it immediately became a sugar-based hard seltzer.
Yeah, it's a huge call out. I don't think we're going to talk about them specifically, but again, as we do go forward and talk about the rules for wine and spirits, just recognize that those will then apply to wine or spirits-based hard seltzers if you're going to go that direction. And yeah, I think there is a lot of benefit to having a vodka-based hard seltzer. It certainly sounds a little bit clearer for a consumer. A lot of these background rules are going to make that probably harder to sell, or at least a little bit more complicated. So definitely something to consider as you are expanding into hard seltzers. Of recognize what is immediately available and what is going to be a little bit more challenging to get across. So good call out there with the taxes. Finally, the last kind of area we want to talk about that is currently available for you to produce with your brewer's notice are non-alcoholic beers. These are our products without any alcohol, but they're below 0.5%, so they're below that threshold. They may have above 0.0, or even there are some that are 0.0, but are still subject to some general rules. Just because you're calling it a beer, you're sort of indicating that there is a regulated product associated with it that might have some rules. So that gets into the really nitty gritty. The important thing, again, is to recognize how you are deriving the product. If you are producing it and then de-alcoholizing it, you can generally do that under your brewer's notice. The one call out there is that depending on how you are removing alcohol from the product, that may actually require getting a distilled spirits producing license. I think if you're doing reverse osmosis or some of those other distilling processes, TTB calls that a distilling, and so you need the distilling permit, which is a whole other ball of wax, but it is available out there. Importantly, when we're talking about below 0.5% ABV products, a lot of the rules don't necessarily apply. So labeling, you don't need to have the government warning on there. You don't need to necessarily have you probably don't need a cola. You don't have to have a lot of those other restrictions. Do note that there are rules around saying non-alcoholic or putting on your label 0% alcohol. That can only be done under strict specific circumstances. And so just be aware of those, and be aware again of general trade practice rules, advertising provisions. Even though it's a non-alcoholic product, that doesn't mean you can start selling it to kids. Certainly not advertising it. A lot of rules around there. I don't know if you have any stories you want to add in there, or you seem like you're about to jump at something.
Yeah, I was going to say, because there actually, I believe, is a class action lawsuit again, and I want to say it's against Heineken because their beer either says non-alcoholic or 0.0, but it is not. It is, there is alcohol in it, and it's interesting. So, and a lot of, I actually am a member of an NA beer group on Facebook, and it is interesting because when you have people who are recovered alcoholics, they don't want to have any trace of alcohol, but they might like the taste, and so it is very important to them that labeling be very clear and very accurate.
Yeah.
And pretty much when people get upset about those things is when you start to see lawsuits. So I think that's one of the reasons around the strict rules is you are dealing with a group of people some of whom it's extremely important to them what they're reading on that label and how accurate it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's so much of what underlies all of these alcohol rules is just being very clear about what is in the bottle, what people are being consumed. I don't think we're necessarily going to go back to pre-prohibition days where you buy a bottle of whiskey and who knows where it came from or what's actually in it, if it's turpentine. But, these are still important. And especially when it comes to non-alcoholic products, that's a very good shout out. Is a lot of people don't really want to be drinking any alcohol, not even trace amounts. So got to be clear about that. I will say I have participated myself previously in some non-alcoholic beer webinars for craft beer professionals. So we're really breezing through a lot of this information, but I'd say there is more stuff out there. And so maybe check through the rest of this wherever you're watching this, on Facebook, on YouTube. There are probably some videos out there that will talk more about NA beer, what are the rules? And again, I mean, same with anything with this is just make sure to check up and really get more thorough information when and if you are going to go into these products. But yeah, it's just recognizing that at least with your current brewer's notice, there is a lot more opportunity than just strictly, Reinheitsgebot version of beers. You can get into these other malt substitute products, non-A beers, kombuchas. There's a lot of variation out there. And so you may not necessarily need to go and get a new license, a whole new business line if you want to expand. However, if you do want to expand, if you do want to get into these other products, well, this is when we get into more rules. So let's break down what are the federal rules for products that don't meet the definition under the IRC or the FAAA of beer or malt beverage. And we'll start with wine. It's a big product out there. I think we all have had some experience of wine. Again, there is a specific definition that will actually be a lot more encompassing and include a lot of products. So under the IRC and the FAAA, wine is another fermented beverage produced from grapes or other fruits. They include berries in that, so it's not just a scientific definition of fruits. And then critically, the definition includes other substitute agricultural products, which really can include a whole range of different things. And so this is where you get not merely traditional grape wine, but you would get like apple wine or cider or tomato wine, carrot wine, pepper wine, all sorts of things. They are out there. I don't know who's drinking them, but somebody's making them. I don't want to be blithe. A lot of them can be very good. And so if you are in this position to maybe, create an expansive product, if you have a market for that, look into this. And because wine would be the way to go about it. And then just know that when you are making one of these products, there's not special rules for doing it with, tomatoes versus grapes. These are all the same rules. And then it starts again with the licensing process. This is a different federal license than your brewer's notice. It's called a basic permit for the wine industry, slightly different. But then you will need to have that wine registration with the TTB. Again, formulas, these are something that are often required, but like with beer, if you're making it in a traditional manner, they're not always required. It's usually when you're just adding things, ingredients, additives, colorings, that sort of thing is when a formula would be required. Again, just so the TTB can make sure you're not adding anything strange. And I believe that the wine list of acceptable traditional materials, I have a memory of that being updated. So it was at least within the last 10 years. Oh, and again, I think it's fairly expansive. So a lot of juices and juice concentrates are now allowed without formulas. But it comes down to those, if it's it's got to be fairly agricultural in its basis. Otherwise, you're looking at a formula. You want to talk a little bit about these other rules for wine?
You know what? I will tell you, wine is the least amount of experience I have because there's so many wine lawyers.
Yeah.
So no one ever comes to me for wine. So I'll let you take. Let you take this one. I'll take cider and mead though. If you want.
Yeah, we'll queue up for those. Because again, it's as agriculture products, I think a lot of these rules will apply, although there are, it's always the devil's in the details. So again, when we're talking about wine, same sort of pattern with beer. It's always about the details that are different. Labeling, same with beer. You need to have proper labels. All wine products are subject to the IRC requirements, which include making sure you identify the brand, the producer, the contents of the bottle, the size of the bottle, make sure you have that government warning. And just like, a little side there, the government warning is one of those things that causes people a lot of trouble just because it can be very finicky in how it needs to be presented. And so when you're going to get a cola, that's when the TTB will send it back for review, is because, you forgot to put it all in caps, or you didn't leave enough space between the colon and the rest of the words. So, just don't be cute with the government warning. Use established formulas and get that. And that's one way you can get your colas approved a lot faster generally. The big area to be aware of with wine and labels is that, I suppose there are reasons, although they're a little bit obscure to me. Wines under 7% ABV are excluded entirely from the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. So, which means, again, like with those beer products that are not made from hops, they are ineligible to get a cola. Which means that if you're doing that, you don't need a cola. You can't get a cola, but that does mean then the FDA rules apply for those products. So if you're making a low ABV wine, you will need that nutritional statement. You'll need other facts and everything, allergy statements and all that, and just be aware that colas are not there. Still subject to the IRC, so you still need the government warning and all those. Another new area with wine is that they have slightly different standards of fill. So these are rules around what size of bottles and how you can describe them. Beer is pretty expansive. I think that there's a lot of different variation on the sizes of bottles and cans that are available. Wine, and we'll talk about spirits, are more limited. There's actually a specific list of allowable bottle sizes. They are expanding the TTB. I think just in January added a new rule, greatly expanding the standards of fill. So you're not stuck with just 330s or 750s and 150s. But know that there is a specific list. Critically, wine must be sold in metric bottles. You must use metric measurements on this. So this is one thing to be aware of is if you're moving from beer to wine, you can't necessarily use the same bottles and cans you're using in your beer. You will need a new supply of containers because of these different standards of fill. So just be aware of that and make sure you're preparing for that. And then again, make sure you're saying 750 milliliters on your bottle, not 1 pint and 4 ounces or however much. Reporting, again, similar to beer reporting, there is a regular report that must be filed. The timing will depend again on your amount of taxes owed, but it's fairly similar to beer in terms of what needs to be reported and when. The big thing with wine is that they have a lot more complicated taxes, just frankly because there's more different variations on wine and different schedules. So this is not only provided within the IRC, but there are also a lot of credits that have been recently added to make it a little bit complicated. So here we'll see the breakdown of the schedule for wine tax rates. So you can see there are, at least just on this one page, at least 3 different class types. So there is below 16%, there's between 16 and 21% ABV, and then over 21 or 21 to 24% ABV. Because if it's over 24%, it's actually a spirit. That's one thing I kind of elided over earlier. I don't think there's any fruit that naturally ferments to over 24%. So if you're getting that high, it has additives in it. That's why it's going to be a spirit. And even to get over 16% generally requires a little boosting. But you can see there are, and that's why it's taxed a little bit more. You can see this breakdown of under 16%. It's $1.07 per gallon. Then it's $1.57 per gallon, or $3.15 per gallon for the really heavy stuff. However, you may remember a few years ago there was the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act, which added a tremendous amount of credits and changes to these tax schedules. I think that's where this moved up to 16% as the threshold. And so if you are a wine producer and you are in one of these categories where you are producing less than 750,000 wine gallons per year, you can be eligible for credits on your different production. And so we don't necessarily need to break all these down right here. A lot of numbers that I'm going to get confused about, but just be aware of that you can get credits on your production if you're not producing so much. And then similarly, just following up, again, more different tax classes of wine here. So there is a further category of very low ABV wine, and then the carbonated wines, your sparkling wines. This kind of goes back to the idea of beer for the masses, so it's taxed cheaply. Spirits are evil, so it needs to be heavily taxed, and wine is for the rich people, so you can tax them a little bit more, and especially champagne. That's really gouge them if you can, and so that's why sparkling wine has that extra high tax rate when it comes to other products. Again, please.
I was going to jump in and point out one thing, because this was something that my brain. So now that I'm filing beer reports and wine reports, and when we get to spirits, is beer we file in barrels. Now we're in wine. We deal with wine gallons. So just make sure that you make that switch. Okay, now I'm dealing in wine gallons, which is a whole different. Well, obviously it's a different measurement unit, but like you just want to make sure that you're in the right space when you're doing this stuff, because it was a little bit of a transition. I'm like, it's been barrels in my head for 10 years, and now all of a sudden I gotta look at something different. Like, oh.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's a great point.
and then when we get
Yeah,
to spirits, it'll be even more different, just to
yeah,
just to make it
exactly. Yeah, we'll
fun.
talk about that in a minute. But it's, yeah, interesting how they can look the same for beer and spirits, but then you realize, oh wait, this is per barrel versus per liter. That's really changes that calculation there.
Yeah. And then proof gallon.
Exactly. Yeah, very, very, very fun. So again, those are kind of the general rules around wine, but then here we'll talk a little bit about more specific wine. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to take over this, Candace. Now we're moving on
Sure.
to
I mean,
cider areas.
again, same license as wine. I mean, since cider comes from fruit, that's why it's considered a wine. Even though definitely a lot of everyone kind of treats it as if it falls kind of in the beer world. Again, probably going to have formulas if you're using non-traditional ingredients. The big difference, I believe, is the ABV and kind of what that brings into the mix. So again, like wine, over 7% need a colon, under 7% FDA rules. Again, just like everybody else, you need to identify the producer, the contents, government warning. You'll report it in that. Actually, I believe in the wine report, there is a section specifically for cider.
Right.
But as we get to the next screen, taxes is where it gets a little different.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just add a little anecdote I remember sharing about labeling specifically for cider, because cider apples don't necessarily ferment naturally to the same rate as grapes. So most ciders are capped out at about 8.5%. So or often are below 7% even. So most ciders that are sold out there, I think this is why people complain with beer, will be subject to the FDA rules. And one of the FDA rules is you have to indicate the concentration of fruit juice in your product. A lot of cideries will want to advertise, made from natural apples, only pure natural ingredients. However, under the FDA rules, if a product has any alcohol in it, technically it is 0% juice under their strict definitions. And so I've heard a lot of cideries complaining about having to, on their front label, they say made with pure, juice. On the nutritional label, it has to say 0% juice. And so I don't know if this is maybe some area that the FDA can work with everybody and figure this out, but it is just one of those sort of annoying compliance issues that, again, frankly, this is why you would want to talk to an FDA labeling specialist, so you're aware of those little details. But as you're saying, the big important thing why cider is different from most grape wines is the taxes. So what are the tax situation like?
Well, as you can see, 22.226 cents per gallon. But yes, but to be eligible for the hard cider tax class, this is kind of the key, is that you've got to be follow these guidelines. No more than 0.64 grams CO2 to 100 milliliters, composed of 50% apple or pear juice or apple pear juice concentrate and water.
Yeah, at least that.
No other fruit products or fruit flavoring other than apple and pear. And then between 0.5% and up to 8.5% alcohol by volume. And then you can also potentially get the tax credits.
Yeah, but again, it's that tax break you get, and again, very, this is where cider is a little bit of a unique wine, in that if it's that apple or pear juice, gets the credits. If you're making tomato wine, unfortunately, it's going to be taxed at the full rate. The other, kind of unique product out there is mead. So again, do you want to talk a little bit about how mead is regulated? What makes this different?
I mean, again, mead, which was something that I know a lot of my brewers had a real problem with in the beginning, that they couldn't make mead under their brewing license, although I believe they made some variation of mead. I don't remember what they called it, but because it is honey wine, so it falls under wine. So you do have to follow the wine rules. Now, granted, I actually don't have any mead clients, so it sounds like Alex you may know a little more than I do on this product. as it being
Yeah.
other than, well, mainly because I don't know anything about wine. So the other than standard wine.
Yeah, I think it's again kind of a unique product because it is then, I think this is where I personally have a little bit of that back and forth because if it's a sugar, then it's a malt substitute, but if it's honey, it's an agricultural product. But that has been specifically defined by the federal government. So yeah, honey is a agricultural product, not a malt substitute. So it is going to follow under a lot of those wine rules. Mead, there are some further regulations around mead, so that again, as we're saying here, the TTB says it cannot exceed 14% ABV, cannot include additional wine spirits, must be derived, wholly from wine without other such in it. You can put hops in mead, but it has to be fairly strictly limited to these honey products. That does not mean those other products are illegal. It just means they can't call them a mead or a honey wine. It's got to be a other than standard wine, which then would mean that all the other wine rules would apply. But again, I think generally when we're talking about mead and honey wine in general, it will be the wine rules that are active. So those labeling, COLA rules, taxes, all the same sort of thing. It's just a matter then of recognizing, can you actually call it mead, or do you need to call it something else on the label? Is that real key consideration there? And so again, as we're just breaking it down, it's the same as we saw with wine. You'll need that wine basic permit. You need the formula if you're using non-traditional ingredients. Labels, if it's below 7%, seems unlikely, but if it's below, then no COLA, but FDA rules apply. And again, there are no special tax breaks for mead. It's all just another type of wine in general. This brings us on to the other big category of products out there, though, of distilled spirits. And distilled spirits, so this is, again, a huge category of products out there, which basically encompasses everything that has been distilled. This is when you take a fermented product, a beer or a wine, and you process it through stills, and you concentrate it into a pure alcoholic product, and then, compose it and flavor it and bottle it and everything. Notably, this does not include denatured spirits. So I suppose if you want to get into the business of making industrial alcohol and stuff for cuts and stuff for cleaning engines, that would not be associated with a lot of these rules. But if you're still making beverages, that's what I'm more paying attention to. That's when a lot of these rules will apply. And I think one of the key considerations with spirits is that this is, as I say, it's a huge category. This encompasses everything has been distilled, and a lot of these different products have their own different definitions, different rules. And so you want to be aware of all the different class types out there. If you're going to start making a whiskey versus a gin versus a vodka versus cordials, they're all different definitions, different specific parameters of not necessarily how they can be made, but about, or I suppose when it gets to things like bourbon, there's some rules around how it can be made, but more about how it can be labeled and et cetera like that. I don't know if there's anything you want to talk necessarily about these spirits, or is this another wine area?
No, I would say, it's funny because spirits is something I've definitely delved into, and it can be really complicated. I guess is what it comes down to. And we didn't really break down all the different kinds of distilled spirits, but I think the biggest thing that I run into, because I do a lot of reporting, is that when people apply for their DSP, their basic permits, they check off all the boxes. Yeah, I'm going to store spirits. I'm going to store it. I'm going to warehouse it, distill it, rectify it. And then they don't really do all those things. So I have people who just rectify, but checked off and I think it's just the assumption, well, I'll just check it off just in case. I might want to do that.
Then
but I'll warn you, for everything you check off, you're going to file a monthly report for, whether you use it or not. And so, there's people who are literally making spirits, bottled spirits, that you mix and make cocktails. You've got people who are rectifying. So they're taking a spirit and then they're putting flavor into it and making a bottle. And then most popularly, we have canned cocktails. So you're taking spirits, watering them down, putting into a can, mixing it with flavors. And you may or may not be making the actual spirits. So then you're either just a rectifier. Anyway, the big tip there is when you're applying, know what you're going to be doing and try to only check off what you're going to be doing, because you're going to create a whole lot of other work for yourself if you go overboard. And you can always go back and amend. So let's say I'm just going to distill and now I want to rectify. Well, just you go back in and you amend your license and you just, I think, literally just check another box.
Sure.
It's very easy, but you can start to make things really complicated for yourself really quickly. Yeah. And the reporting is also very complicated, because think of it as your storage is a bucket, your production, your distilling is a bucket, and then your rectifying, processing, bottling is a bucket. And you have to tell them every month how much went from where to where. So if it went storage to distilling, then distilling back to storage, or it went to distilling and then distilling onto processing, or storage went to processing or bottling. And it's yeah. There's got to be an easier way to do it than the TTB forms, but and you have to do them monthly rather than quarterly. So they really, really, really want to follow up on how this is done. Now you still only pay your taxes theoretically quarterly, or you only have to file that quarterly if you're on this level. But again, it's how often you pay is based on how much you owe.
Right.
But the reporting is monthly. And I will also say this, as I have a distilled spirits client going through a TTB audit, is when they come and they're looking at all your reports and things, are a little wonky, they're going to want to know why. And if you don't have the records to show them why, like, it's okay to have screwed up. It's okay to have like 1 month where you had a big loss because, you had to dump something, but you need to have those backup records, at least notes saying why you dumped it, or like, on this day, we tested this batch and tasted like crap, something went wrong, we dumped it. So you need to be able to back up. So they are going to look at those reports and want to know that, like, oh, well, why did you lose this month? One thing I learned recently is the official difference between shortage and loss. Shortage means you don't know where it went. When you did your inventory, there's just less than there used to be, and you don't know why.
Angel share.
It might have walked away. And loss is you literally like dropped it on the floor, it went down the drain, but those reports, they're very important to the government, and they want them done as correctly as possible. They totally understand. But anyway, I'm going off because this was an area I found very difficult to learn.
Yeah, it's when you spend months on something, it really sticks with you then. I think just to go back a little bit, again, with spirits, if you're going to make these products, you will need a new license. That's that direct spirits production. Formulas are a little bit more common with spirits than with beer and wine, I think, because they're just more often additives or flavorings or colorings that go into these. And again, just be aware of the different product types, class types out there that have different rules. Labeling, again, a little bit more complicated. You have the same general brand name, class type. Importantly, that these brand name, class type, and alcoholic content needs to be in the same field of vision. So it can't be, you have your alcoholic content on the back of the label. It's got to be something directly there for the consumer to see. And when it comes to the alcoholic content statement, that is always required for spirits. It's something that is optional for beer and wine, always required for distilled spirits. You need to have that, 51% alcohol by vol. The rest of the labeling requirements can be on the back of the label or elsewhere on the bottle. You can also express your alcohol content in proof. That's an optional, but know that it has to be different from your alcohol by vol statement. There are no real exceptions to colas like there are with beer and wine for those low ABV or non-hop products. However, if you are only selling your spirit product in state, you can apply for what's called a certificate of exemption of label approval. Honestly, it's essentially the same thing as a cola, so I don't know why people would get a CLEA instead of a cola, but it is available if you are only selling in state. Otherwise, you will need to have the TTB review it at some point.
And I actually was going to say this. I made a note to remind myself. So in general about colas, just because they aren't required doesn't mean it's not a good idea to go ahead and get one.
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
even if you're selling interstate, the last thing you want to do is want to go out of state, apply that label you already have for a cola, and get rejected because you didn't spell out India Pale Ale somewhere on the label. And now all of a sudden you can't send the beer that you already have across state lines. So
not
it doesn't
without
cost
recanning
anything.
everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't cost anything, just a little bit of time. And then you're good. Or oh wow, what we have now is not good. So to change it. But again, before you get to that point of wanting to ship it across state lines or ordering, a stupid number of cans or labels that aren't going to work.
Yeah, there's, there are products that are ineligible to get colas, but everything else, it takes a little bit of time, but obviously I agree, definitely a good idea. Then last quick thing about distilled spirits. Again, this is a lot heavier tax product than the other products. So we're looking at, 270 per proof gallon for the first 100,000 proof gallons you make, then 1334 per proof gallon for everything above that. Importantly, those lower rates are only eligible if you are actually distilling or processing the spirits yourself. If you are not distilling or processing the spirits, if you are not, you're importing or other types of activity within this, then you will be stuck at the 13.50 per proof gallon tax rate. And again, that is per proof gallon, not per barrel. So obviously a lot more expensive than beer taxes. So as Candace was saying, if you're thinking of getting into spirits as opposed to beer, be aware that it's going to be that much more expensive to get them out. The last quick area we want to talk about at the federal level, and we are a little bit running out of time, so we want to be quick about this last little bit. Just a quick word about sake. Again, another interesting developing product out there, getting a little bit more common in domestic production. The big question about sake is it a beer? Because it's wine. Because it's produced from a malt substitute. Rice explicitly is indicated as a malt substitute to make it a beer product, but it's definitely consumed and sold like wine. And so a lot of regulators kind of split the difference. And specifically, the TTB will regulate sake as a beer for tax and production. So you produce it under a brewer's notice, and it will be taxed like and reported like beer. But all the labeling and formula rules for wine apply to sake. So it gets a little bit even very confusing. Most states generally define sake as a wine. They'll explicitly indicate it, sake or rice wine as a wine. But there are a couple exceptions out there that you just want to be aware of. And speaking of those state rules and how this goes, again, you want to be aware of these different rules for these non-beer products because they are different when you are now selling in the states. States follow a lot of federal guidelines, but they have their own parameters, particulars, and rules around them. One of the key areas is licensing concerns when it comes to states. Most states you have to get licensed by the state to do most activity there, and they usually have different licenses for beer, wine, and spirits. Often the beer and wine licenses can be combined, especially at the sales level, but spirits is often a completely different category. So if you're going to be producing in a state, you'll need to get a new production license. This is really an area where you're probably going to need a new license from your state. I think, maybe Candace, you can clarify this. I think generally you can continue to get a new license for your existing premises. The big thing is you will probably need to have separate storage areas, I think. And you will want to make sure that it's just very clear of, what is your winery versus what is your brewery if it's going to be at the same address.
Yeah, it's basically, so a lot of people may have heard of an alternating proprietorship where two different companies share a premise. In this instance, you're going to have an alternating premise, and that'll be both with TTB and with your state, because at least on the TTB side, you will have to have some exclusive space for your brewery and your distillery. Some states, California, for example, you can 100% overlap. And every state's going to be different, just like everything else. But alternating premise is what you're going to do when you have to have the same license in some area that is shared. I always think of the Venn diagram, the little middle part is the shared part.
Yeah, it's a good visual there. Similar when we're talking about supplier licenses, if you want to sell into different states, that is often going to require a new license as well. This is an area where I think we see a little bit more beer combined licenses, out-of-state supplier of fermented products. But just be aware of there might be different licenses. If you're already selling into Texas, you might need a different license to sell your spirits products now. And be aware that distributors are also require separate licenses. It may still be the same entity, but they would be maybe or a different version of that entity. And so be aware you may not necessarily be able to sell your RTD spirits to the same RTD malt distributor. Just be checking on that. And it goes down to the retail level as well. Beer and wine can be sold in a lot of grocery stores, gas stations around. Spirits are often prohibited from being sold in those stores. So again, this is just a consideration when you're trying to sell in different areas. This is why there is a malt-based Fireball whiskey out there, or whiskey-like product, so that it can be sold in gas stations. But the spiritus Fireball cannot be sold in gas stations. Just a consideration as to where your products can be available. Further, when we're talking about distribution, there are a lot of franchise rules out there. This is actually an area that might be a little bit more of good news if you're moving out of beer. There are a lot of franchise rules are generally stricter on beer, largely because I think they were originally designed to keep Budweiser down or keep Budweiser from pushing everybody around. So there are just less concerns about big guys in wine and spirits. That is not to say they don't exist. So just be aware of these franchise rules and be aware when you are negotiating with your new distributors in these different states. Don't just sign what they send you. Talk to your attorney, talk to somebody, read your contracts, make sure that you are aware of all the parameters, and make sure whoever counsel you're working with is a alcoholic expert like Candace and is aware of these franchise rules, so there are no limits on your contracting ability, your termination, all those sort of things that can get you in trouble if you're just using a contract that you would use to sell T-shirts. It's not going to be the same. Similarly, brand registrations, another area you may be aware of selling beer. States, this is similar to a COLA process, but on the state level, they want to have their own record of what's being sold in the state. They're generally not reviewing the labels. They just want to have a record. But these processes can be different for the different product types. There might be different forms or different timing, different costs for the labels. Again, just sort of be aware that these things might be out there. And similarly with price posting. Again, I think price posting is a little bit more common, a little bit more active in beer. So this might be something that's smoother with wine and spirits. But again, the rules can be different. So you just want to be aware of them. One area, sorry, got ahead of myself. Again, just reminder with taxes, just as we saw with the TTB, wine and spirits are treated differently at the state level. Again, wine is generally taxed higher than beer, and spirits are generally taxed a lot higher than both wine and beer. So just being aware of that. Cider generally is taxed at beer rates. So just like the federal government has a break for cider, a lot of states do as well. One area that's kind of a hot button issue right now is reduced tax rates for spirituous RTDs and seltzers. A lot of these seltzers or vodka seltzer, they're saying, why is this taxed at $10 per gallon, whereas the other is taxed at $10 per barrel? So there are a lot of efforts to create reduced tax rates for lower RTDs. Not everywhere, not even all that common, but are spreading around. So just be aware of the different rates, aware of the different processes that might apply. One big area is control states. This is something that may be completely novel if you were just selling beer right now. There are currently 17 states that maintain a control model. This is when the state actually acts as part of the alcohol industry. Generally, they are only acting as a distributor. Generally, they are only controlling spirits products. But that's not always the case. There are, about a half dozen states that do also control wine. So if you're selling wine products in that state, you need to sell them to the state. And if you're selling spirits, it's almost always going to be to the state in these situations. And there are a few places where they'll actually operate retail stores as well. The main consideration here is that when you're selling to a control state, you're actually selling to the government. So it just makes that initial process a lot more complicated. Because when you're selling it, you're not only needing to convince them that you have a good product that wants to be sold, you're selling to a distributor, you also need to be managing all your compliance and registrations at the same point. So there are a lot of rules, a lot of strict schedules, a lot of requirements around listing with a control board. You often have to use an in-state agent or broker. A lot of states will say we're only going to look at new products like once or twice or 4 times a year. So you can't just say, oh, we'll go in next month. There's a strict schedule. Again, this is just more of a very high level warning. If you are especially going to be selling spirits into these states, just be aware that the process is going to be just that much more complicated. And lastly, apologizing for going a little bit long here. We're really catching up. Just wanted to quick mention, because this is especially an area of focus for mine, is direct shipping of alcohol. Direct consumer shipping is, again, a huge issue, very developing. And there are different rules for the different products. If you are making a product that is defined as a wine in the different states, that is then available almost nationally. There are only Mississippi and Delaware and Utah, Mississippi recently passed a law, currently allow direct consumer shipping of wine. So if you're going to get into wine, it's very easy to sell this directly to consumers. If you're selling beer, that's only about 12 states allow it, and even fewer for spirits. So just be aware of this as an option. The rules around direct shipping can get very complicated. There are a lot of particulars around this. So I'll just leave you with be aware this is an option. Be aware there's a lot of interest in expanding options for beer and spirits. So reach out to your guilds and talk to people if you want to change the laws in your state. And if you want to know more about, if you're making wine or if you're selling into those other states, you want to know about direct shipping of alcohol, please reach out to us. We have a lot of information at Sovos ShipCompliant about this and can talk to you for days about all these different rules. Just know it gets complicated, a lot of taxes, a lot of licensing, all these different things. So, don't go into it blithely, but be aware that is an option and can be done successfully. So again, I kind of breezed through that. I don't know if I missed anything you wanted to bring up there, Candace, in the last few slides.
No, I think you did great.
Again, I think if there's any one last message we just want to leave you with, it is don't be afraid to ask for help. There's so many rules on every little part of the alcohol industry, everywhere, every line. There's a lot of complication. And as we're seeing, it's, you may think you're making a beer, but it turns out that there's a slightly different process that means these other rules don't apply to it. And you just want to be aware of that. You want to be getting ahead of these considerations. So reach out for help, have somebody on file, have some counsel or a consultant, or just talk to each other. Reach out to your guilds. There's a lot of information just within the industry to help you out and to help make you successful, because that's really what we want. So that's just the overall message is be aware there's a lot out there. Be aware it gets complicated. Be aware that there are people to make this easier for you. And that's, if nothing else, that's the message to leave you with. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Candace, for really helping me a lot with this presentation and helping explain some of those particulars out there.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate you reaching out and allowing me to be here.
Yeah, well, it's all about, sharing expert information. And again, thank you for joining us. And thank you to the Craft Brewers Professionals organization for hosting us. And we hope to see you again and connect with you on further brewing issues and regulatory concerns. So until next time.